Thank you for being here. You are here in the Motherhouse Starter Series, the foundational course for mother law and complicit no more. We are Injustice Futures, and we work with movement partners and religious communities to create land transitions rooted in ecological and racial healing. We seek to heal stories on sacred lands, to liberate land and relationships from colonial constraints in service of life. You can learn more about our work, our focus community program, and our public educational offerings about land justice from our website, which I think is being dropped in the chat. This is session 3 of this starter series, focused on the doctrine of discovery and our relationship to land. Hopefully y'all were already with us for sessions 1 and 2 or caught up on the replay. And so you know what this Motherhouse Starter Series is all about, mother law and complicit no more, as well as the relationships and movement context that it comes from. We're here to springboard our own remembering, to reclaim our authority and the mother law that lives within the seeds of our own cultures and lineages. As our advisor and Auntie Pat McCabe would say, we're here to put life at the center of all we do and to start living toward right relationship right now. Last session, we heard from Sarah Augustine, who gave us a deep historical and personal perspective on the doctrine of discovery and its impacts across levels of society and culture. It was heavy, and I hope that everyone took some time to care for themselves, to lament, to metabolize what was shared. In that space, we learned that the biggest problems we face as a species are all deeply entangled with the doctrine of discovery and the systems it initiated across the globe. This root system grows from and interweaves a wide web of projects. The co-optation of Christianity by empire, colonialism by the church and European states, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, the transatlantic slave trade, the genocide of indigenous peoples across the globe, white Christian supremacy and the westward expansion of the United States, anti-Blackness and attempted indigenous erasure, not to mention the extractive capitalism that destroys the earth and requires an underclass of labor, a system which currently fuels the climate catastrophe and undergirds the present-day struggles of indigenous communities, Black communities, and the global South. So it is one heck of a Gordian knot. We learned that the doctrine of discovery is an active legal doctrine in the United States, within international law, and within other nations around the world. We learned that the doctrine of discovery is an ideology of conquest and dehumanization, and it is a policy structure that has impacts on every level and in every form for Black, indigenous, and working class and poor communities. Poverty, incarceration, families broken up by the state, lower life expectancy, poor health outcomes, homelessness, addiction, forced sterilization, police brutality, a racist education system, suicide rates, political instability, and forced migration. It goes on. These are the stories that Sarah Augustine shared with us. And she also shared that the doctrine of discovery impacts those of us who are even beneficiaries of this system, and it harms us as well. As I said, it was a heavy session centered on a personal perspective within a globalized system and polycrisis. And in that spirit of weaving all that we learned from that session into our space today, we'd like to ground together. So if you brought a candle, I invite you to light it and bring the energy of our last time together into our space today. I'd like to ask you, what's something that's been with you since last week? Maybe it's something that Sarah Augustine said or our theological council. Maybe it's something you've been thinking about from the homework, or that's just been nagging at you in the days between. Whatever it is, a feeling, a question, a phrase, a word, give yourself a moment to inhabit it and let that linger with you. And if you're ready, you can drop that word or phrase or feeling in the chat. And we'll give a moment for this. It's important to us to weave these times together as we weave within ourselves across these sessions. So we have devastation, grief, the question, how can I truly be complicit no more? Othering, deep ache of babies taken. Meditation on the motherline. Meditation on Indigenous grandmothers. Sadness yet hope for the future. Severing and remembering. We are fighting for our lives. Thank you. And feel free to let those continue to come in. So thank you for naming some of those things. Hopefully it's helping you become more present with this call that we're here for today to move towards mother law and be complicit no more. Just a few housekeeping reminders. As always, you can find most of what you need on our course page. Replays of sessions, homework, community guidelines. That is going to be dropped in the chat right there if you don't have it handy. During the course of our session, please stay on mute unless you're in a breakout or we're inviting larger discussion. If you have questions during the sessions, please direct message Amy or Brittany in the chat so that we disrupt attention to our speakers less. They have tech in front of their names. And on that note, we'd love to invite and remind folks to stay present and attentive to our speakers and to refrain from using the chat too much during their talks, as it can be disruptive and distracting sometimes for other participants. There will be moments when we invite you all to respond in the chat, and there will be time to unpack in small groups. This request to be mindful includes a request to not spam the chat with a bunch of resources. If there's a resource that you think is very on topic and would be really helpful for people, please email us at hello@landjusticefutures.org, and we'll try to include it in a follow-up. Thank you so much for helping us direct our intention and our attention to be with our speakers. And of course, if you need to be in touch with us after the session, you can email us there as well, and we'll get back to you as soon as we're able. Lastly, I think you all were notified in your last email, but given the technical limitations of Zoom and our team's very human capacity with such a large group, we are going to be changing course with the breakout groups. So we will no longer be trying to keep the exact same small groups every week. If you are part of a community or an existing group, so maybe you're a member of one of our focus communities or another group like Jews on a Lonely Land or the Episcopal Roundtable, or if you simply have friends and comrades that are part of this course, we invite you to connect with them out of session to discuss and process sessions when you can. So apologies for the inconvenience of that change up, but we think this is the best way forward. So unless you choose to be placed in a Black, Indigenous, or people of color room or opt out of the breakout groups, we will be randomly grouping folks into fours for the breakout sessions. They'll be about 15 minutes long, so they're pretty short anyways, and we hope that that is enough time for you to just begin to chew on what's moving in you, as well as get the chance to hear from other people how they're metabolizing things. So we invite you to deepen through longer conversations outside of the course with the people you are in community with. So if you don't want to be in a breakout group, we ask that you just don't accept your assigned breakout room and you can stay muted in the large group. And if you want to be put in a BIPOC only caucus space, please add the letter B to the beginning of your name on Zoom. If you have trouble with that, you can just direct message Brittany or Amy in the chat. Okay, with that, I think those are most of my logistics. Again, just a reminder that to be present with what we're receiving today. So inviting a posture of letting ourselves receive and letting, the vigilant mind relax into some open attention with our teachers. Okay, logistics are done. Let's dive into the program for today. Thank you again for being here and being part of this movement. As I mentioned before, today is session 3 of this series, The Doctrine of Discovery at Work in Our Relationship to Land. We are joined by 2 people with years and years of work in defending against Black and Indigenous land loss and supporting land reclamation and restoration through the law. We have tribal attorney Jessica Intermill and senior attorney Mary Henderson of the Land Loss Prevention Project. Today, we'll study exactly how the Doctrine of Discovery and colonial law facilitated the theft of land, which undergirds our modern economy, and how it created a now ubiquitous but largely unnatural worldview of land, individualized, commodified, separated as private property. By examining the very laws that made that wealth accumulation possible, we see that this worldview was made up, and therefore it can be unmade. We'll also be joined by Bronte Velez, a transdisciplinary ritual artist, shepherd, and educator, as well as a member of our Theological Council, who will offer some reflections on the doctrine's impact on our relationship to land and what it means to heal that rupture. Again, building on from the last week's session, as we learned, the doctrine is an active legal doctrine that underpins the system of sovereignty and land title in the United States and many other nations that were colonized. This legal doctrine originates from a series of papal bulls or letters from the Pope in Rome, who compelled European nations to, quote, invade, capture, and vanquish all non-Christians and subdue them into perpetual servitude. These papal bulls served as the legal, moral, spiritual, and political justification for the transatlantic slave trade, the genocide of indigenous peoples, and by 1914, the colonization of 84% of the land on Earth by European nations. Through these bulls, the church declared any land not inhabited by Christians to be empty, quote unquote, and available to be discovered and claimed outright by European nations and settlers, which then became encoded into law around the world, which we'll hear a little bit more about. In the United States, it was encoded into U.S. law by the Supreme Court in 1823 during westward expansion, and has been cited as recently as in 2005 by the Supreme Court. An active legal doctrine and policy structure for 200 years, the doctrine has created a reality in which 98% of all private rural land in the U.S. is owned and controlled by white people, and 95% of urban private land. Furthermore, as we talked about with Sarah, the underlying premises of the Doctrine of Discovery, the logic of white Christian supremacy and human supremacy and elite dominion over the earth, are encoded into our culture in ways that go way beyond the law. but into the very fabric of our worldview and relationships. It's an ideology that thingified the world for conquest, human beings, and the world itself. It initiated a culture of commodification and consumption, of extraction and the profit of the few. So this is what we're going to get into today. We'll hear from Jessica Innermill, we'll hear a bit from Mary, and afterwards we'll hear some reflections from Bronte, followed by an embodiment practice and dialogue in small groups. We'll then hear from our theological council and close with a poem. But first, let's ground with a short documentary film. It's just about 4 minutes, called Tangled Roots, which was created by our partners at the New Economy Coalition and demonstrates one of the ways the impacts of this legal doctrine and capitalist ideology shape people's relationship to land, home, and belonging today. Thank you, Brittany.
I remember North Richmond as being your picture of a southern town. Music in the air, there was flavor in the air, like food cooking, churches going all the time, the clubs going all the time. People's dressed up on Sundays. Public housing, those projects was built in the 40s. People came here in groves during the war because there was plenty of work. But after the war, that was all shut down. The projects wasn't bad at all. It was what they call a stepping stone. People that got into the projects, their goal was to get out and get into their own house. And that's how it was in North Richmond up until they closed it down.
I'm just trying to imagine and picture where everything and everyone was at. I know this area right here was my friend's cousin's house. It was some units over here. This area, these was all homes, all homes, all homes. Like, I cried when I left here because that was my first stepping ground, you know, to being independent, you know, being a first-time mom. I think that's why I was crying. Like, you know, oh, we're getting out of here finally, yes. But like, it's still scary because it's like, now where do we go?
You're doing a lot. You're doing a lot right now. You're doing a lot. I was homeless twice with my kids, once with a husband and once without. When you come back from being homeless and struggling and don't know if you're going to be able to pay the rent, to be able to get into a place where the rent is now, you can breathe, that's what Los Deltas did for me. I drove by a few months ago and everything was torn down. It was a lot to take in.
I just hope for the better. That's all I kept thinking. Like, we're gonna be better, we're gonna be good, you know, we're gonna have a different outlook. You know, I would tell my son that all the time.
You know, you want to be someplace stable. It took me 5 years to get public housing, and I love that place. I really do.
Like I said, it's all about the land. It's all about the land. It's how valuable the land is. North Richmond is just surrounded by nature. You can feel the calmness, you can feel the nature, you can feel the beauty of the land. Peoples with money and wealth are going to find a way to capture this and own this if it's not preserved. So a lot is going to depend on loss of justice redevelopment.
Will I have hope that it'll be redeveloped? Yes. Will it be gentrified? Yes. Will the same people who were living there have the opportunity to come back?
Thank you, Brittany. I'd love to invite our two other speakers up here. We have two lawyers with us who have been in the trenches, so to speak, of Indigenous and Black land rights, dispossession, and reclamation for many years. I'll just introduce you both briefly, and then I'll pass it to you, Jessica, to get started. But so Jessica Intermill is a land history consultant with over 15 years experience as a treaty rights and tribal law attorney. She helps individuals and organizations look underneath their homes, schools, businesses, and congregations to understand the circumstances that formed the history of the land they stand on. As a strategic policy consultant for Minnesota Interfaith Power and Light, Jessica also works to engage congregations in the work of reparations and repair. And we have Mary Henderson with us as well, who is a senior staff attorney with the Land Loss Prevention Project. For 18 years, since 2006, Henderson has participated in the organization's statewide work assisting low-resource homeowners, landowners, and farmers to retain and utilize their real property. She works across practice areas on matters involving heir property stabilization, consumer protection, bankruptcy, farm business and succession planning, and various aspects of environmental and real property law. Welcome to both of you, and thank you so much for being here. I'd love to ask both of you to just spend some time sharing the typical story of how land loss has happened in this country and how settlers in particular have taken land from Indigenous and Black people respectively, and to share what that looked like. What were some of those common legal tactics of dispossession and how they have evolved? And Jessica, I'll start with you. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you so much, LJF, for having me. It is a tremendous honor to join you all on this journey. And thank everyone who has taken time out of their day today and throughout these weeks to really do some unlearning, right? And take an actual hard look at the systems that govern our lives. I am going to share my screen. All right, everybody able to see that? We good? All right,
Yes.
thumbs up. So when I do land history consulting, I help people place themselves in the stream of history to see how land became property at a specific place. Because when you do that, you can see the specifics of how land was stolen from Native people, or put differently, how the United States stole land from Native people, and how it commoditized that land to enrich white men and their families. You all talked last week about the doctrine of the discovery in a more abstract way. How it's essentially a Christian finders keepers doctrine that is global, goes back to 1493, 1452, even before that. But in 1823, it did become law in the United States in a case called Johnson versus McIntosh. And I want to go through some of those specifics and dig in a little bit so that you can see that white supremacy at work. Now, when John Marshall wrote this particular case, he says that the United States have unequivocally acceded to that great and broad rule by which its civilized inhabitants now hold this country. Basically, he says, we're going to tell you the law that white men follow, and it's a great one. We totally dig it. That rule is that discovery gave an exclusive right to extinguish the Indian title of occupancy, either by purchase or by conquest. There's a couple of ideas embedded here. The first is that the tribes could only occupy the land. They didn't do anything else with it. That's of course false, but it was part of the doctrine. And then it essentially says that that discovery blocks other European claims and gives just one country the right to conquer the tribes in the area, assuming that, of course, they are going to do that because that's how property works. Now, even John Marshall, as he's writing it, says, is like, this is a little ishy. This is kind of gross. But we're the courts of the conqueror. That's what the Supreme Court says about itself. And as the courts of the conqueror, we cannot deny, whatever our private opinions are, that conquest gives title. That is the sort of underpinning of the doctrine, is that this is law. We have to follow it. This is something that is in the order of things, right? Even though it already doesn't quite feel right. But it's okay, you guys, because the character and religion of the native inhabitants afforded an apology for considering these indigenous people a people over whom the superior genius of Europe might claim an ascendancy. This is what the Supreme Court said. It is white supremacy that is written into our foundational laws. And it's the moral apology, or the moral alibi that Sarah talked about right here in our law. But the bottom line for John Marshall is that the Supreme Court must adopt the doctrine of discovery, because if we don't, we won't have property. And that can't be right. If we don't adopt the doctrine of discovery, then these various patents, all of the colonial land grants that the United States founding fathers built upon, those would be null. And that can't be right. So instead, doctrine of discovery. All of US property law is grounded in this 1823 decision. It's grounded in white and Christian supremacy. And it's all there because we need those doctrines to protect our magical property rights. That's how it started. Let's look at how it's going. This is a map of Kansas. Each of the colors is a different treaty cession. It comes from the verb cede, C-E-D-E. So it's a different treaty with either one or more tribes. Jewell County is the square at the top. It is in what we would today call north central Kansas. It is basically the belly button of flyover country, is right in the middle. And before colonization, there are several tribes that used this as seasonal hunting grounds, had villages nearby. 1601 is the first recorded contact between Europeans and the Kansa tribe that Kansas is named after. That was with Spanish explorers who were looking for cities of gold. 1702, the French come through. 1705, Lewis and Clark document 2 villages. But when we fast forward to today, Jewell County it's a 5x5 township area that has 2,932 people as of the 2020 census. That actually has declined every year since 1900. This is a county that is losing population very steadily. There's only 3.2 people per square mile, and 97.2% of those people are white. All of the Jewell County area is within this pink area that's labeled 124. That area corresponds to the 1825 treaty with the Kansa. Now, recall that Justice Marshall had told us that even after discovery, the United States had to extinguish tribal use rights, either through conquering or purchase. And the United States didn't have the military capacity to fight every single one of the hundreds of tribes that claimed territory on Turtle Island. So instead, it used treaties. And in this particular treaty, it paid the Kansa for this land with 300 hogs, 500 chicken, 3 yoke of oxen. It's written right into the treaty. There's an annuity that they'll pay for 20 years. And when you add it all up, all of that payment totals 4 mills per acre, less than half a cent per acre. So why would the Kansas agree to that? Because you got to imagine that even in 1825, the land is worth more than half a cent per acre. And it did, but what was more important to the Kansas is that it's not about them not understanding the value of land. It's that they bargained for this blue part. This was an area that was reserved from the 121 treaty. So this is the 1825 treaty area. The blue part is a reservation. It's a right to a way of life for the Kansas in that area. It's a right to be left alone and to continue as a people in that much smaller strip of land. And the United States agreed to this. The superintendent of Indian Affairs said that the whole point of that reservation was to guarantee them lasting and undisturbed possession. That is a place where they will stay, settlers will stay out of. But remember, I told you that every color is a different treaty. So the United States came back to the Kansas in 1846. Lasting and undisturbed lasted about 20 years. And then with the 1846 treaty, the United States came back and purchased that blue area. The market value of that blue area in 1846 was almost $3 million. But that's not what the United States paid. Instead, the United States paid $329,000, almost $330,000. And that's it. A court later on in the 1951 actually said that particular treaty, the 1846 treaty, was unconscionable. It's a legal term that is fairly narrow. And in contract law, it means it's like there was not a contract at all, like it never happened. And the remedy, what the court usually does about an unconscionable contract, is that it undoes it, like it never happened. If that were the case here, the tribe would give back the money and any of the livestock, right, whatever any of the things that it received under the treaty, it would give that back to the United States, and the United States would give back the land. But we don't do that with Indian treaties. Courts can't get their brains around returning tribal lands, even when they can see that the treaty was a fraud. And that's significant for me in my life because nearly 30 years after the court called the theft of the reservation unconscionable, I was born in that reservation territory. My birth certificate does not say I was born in Kansas territory. It says I was born in Kansas. My passport says I'm an American because of the Doctrine of Discovery. My grandparents' house, their farm was in Jewell County. It's part of the 1825 treaty territory. This is what settler colonization looks like. And I want to pause on that because I want you to see that we can be good people. We can have loving families. We can have cute baby pictures. And we can be complicit in a system that prioritizes white bodies and empire over community. Both can be true. In fact, you can be a respected progressive champion and still be complicit in this system. In 2005, the Supreme Court had already decided that the state of New York had stolen land from the Oneida Nation, stolen land within the borders of the state of New York. Now, the Oneida Nation followed the white law, repurchased a parcel of land within that original territory, and tried to govern that land. But when it did, New York and New York City actually sued the Oneida Nation for trying to assert its sovereignty. Ruth Bader Ginsburg took us right back to the doctrine of discovery. Said under that doctrine, the fee title went to the colonists. It became vested, all of the governance vested with those colonizers, not with the tribe, even though the colonizers stole the land, and the Supreme Court has already said that by this point. Says the appropriateness of allowing tribal sovereignty now must be evaluated in light of the long history of state sovereign control. Oh, you know, a couple hundred years. Compare that to the couple of thousands of years before that, but cool, we get you, Ruth. And the justifiable expectations grounded in 2 centuries of New York's exercise of jurisdiction merit heavy weight here. Think of the white folks, y'all. Think about what they expect when they are part of the colonizer system. Because Ruth Bader Ginsburg, writing this majority opinion, did not care about the expectations of the Oneida in this case. It was not a justifiable expectation to expect there would be any remedy for those tribal land thefts. There would not be any expectation that the tribe would be allowed due process of law. Instead, we have to think of the homeowners and what their expectations are. That's what happens when a court can't look beyond its own system and cannot go outside of the system that white propertied founders built for themselves. Okay, so back to Kansas. We saw how the United States stole Kansas land, but when the United States turned that Kansas land into property, this is how it looks. The United States carves the whole countryside into squares, and then it gifts and sells that land in ways that further federal policy, namely federal policies of the prioritization of white folks and empire. And we know those were federal policies because we can follow the money and see that that's exactly what happened to this section of land, the land that became my family's farm. So first, the United States paid that pittance to the Kansas in exchange for a promised reservation that it later took. And then when the United States got these chunks of land, sometimes what it would do is make a direct sale, like to the public, but sometimes it would give away chunks of this land to entities that it wanted to raise funds for, and wanted to do a cash infusion. So sometimes that would be a railroad. One of the biggest ones is land grant universities. So when we say land grant, it's not that the land the college is on was granted. It means that the college or university was gifted a whole bunch of land from the United States to sell as part of its endowment. So the tribal lands would actually create the cash infusion for the public education system, or the railroad, or in this case, Kansas's roads. That's what there's a statute on the books that says that's what those grants are for. So the United States gave Kansas the land, and Kansas did sell the land. It worked exactly like it was supposed to. 7 years later, Kansas sold it for $1.25 an acre. The 4 mil per acre land, the same land resells now for $1.25 an acre. And Dudley Steele poured private funds into this frontier infrastructure. This was part of a huge land purchase all across Kansas. The total sale price for Dudley was $130,000. He was a land speculator. I don't know if Dudley got that land or that cash back because, well, let's go back. We're missing the next record. But if he could afford that sale in 1868, he could afford to lose it. He's a land speculator who is using land essentially like you would the stock market today. And the United States wanted investors to do this because the new country didn't have much cash for itself, right? Same way that it didn't have a whole lot of military power. And so this privatized public infrastructure so that even without its own cash, the United States could manifest its destiny, could build its empire coast to coast. And in exchange, it funneled wealth from tribal lands, from tribal hands, into white ownership. And you can see that two owners and 100 years later, my family sold land that they had acquired for $72 an acre in 1956. They sold for over $366 an acre in 1989. Y'all, my grandparents were hard scrabble folks. They were salt of the earth. They were not wealthy by any stretch of the imagination. And they retired to Arizona after this. The federal policy worked. It moved wealth from tribal hands through an economy that was built with tribal wealth, but meant to enrich white hands and white owners, and it did. And that patterns like this happened all across Kansas in sections and quarter sections and all across the country. The United States used the doctrine of discovery and treaties to steal that land in the first place, and then used US law to turn land into property and give the wealth it stole from tribes to white men. Because even when it was making gifts to the states, well, the states are then going to hire contractors who are white to build the roads. The sale of land was almost always to white men because very few other people had the means to actually purchase land outright. And the US disposal of land under other laws like the Homestead Act or later the GI Bill for subsidized home purchases, those were also often by law only available to white men. And then US law protected that wealth transfer by pointing back to the doctrine of discovery that started all of this and protecting white expectations of property, not tribal expectations of equal protection of the law. The doctrine of discovery lives in our family homes, our synagogues, our churches, our favorite parks. It's in every one of our streets and our place names. It's everywhere we look, and it's alive today.
Thank you so much, Jessica, for that personal and very, very zoomed out and zoomed in story of how this happens. I'm gonna pass the mic right on over to you, Mary. And thank you so much, Jessica, and we'll come back around for some conversation for a little bit. And Mary, you are muted.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for your patience. And thank you so much, Jessica, for that wonderful and very thought-provoking presentation. I'm going to hopefully tie into some of what has already been covered in the sessions you all have been having and with what Jessica spoke about, and bring some different pieces to it as well. So my name is Mary Henderson, and I work at the Land Loss Prevention Project. And as Sarah mentioned, I've been there since 2006. So I come to this topic, you know, as someone who works in this field, right? And let's see. Just to say a little bit about the organization, since that's, you know, where I have built any knowledge or perspective that I can bring to you today comes from the work that I've done and the folks I've had, the honor to meet and work with as their attorney or as someone who is just trying to be in their corner when they're possibly facing land loss. So our organization is in North Carolina, and we work with low-income farmers and landowners in North Carolina. And we were founded out of deep concern about a huge decrease in the amount of land owned by Black farmers and landowners that took place kind of throughout the 1900s. Basically, we work with folks that can't afford their own attorney that they would have to pay. And our focus is on retaining folks' access to land, their land tenure, preventing the loss of it. We are often facing, the specific problem of the person that has walked in the door or who has given us a call, and that can come from a pretty kind of legalistic perspective where someone might have been served with a foreclosure notice, and we're just trying to figure out if we can get them, an argument to make that they can have another 30 days before their hearing. Or someone comes to us wanting to make sure that their family land can be protected over time because it's owned by many people together. And I'll talk a little more about that because that's a pretty common land ownership situation for Black landowners in the Southeast in particular, as well as other groups. So I'm really glad for the opportunity, though, to kind of step back from the kind of emergency room, urgent care role of that we sometimes play to, go ahead and tie together with the broader story and the broader foundations in the context of the doctrine of discovery. So I know in this series, we've talked about how the papal bulls that set out the doctrine that allowed usurping and dominion of land belonging to non-Christians also set out to allow enslavement of non-Christians. So I think the language that I saw from some of the materials from the last session was reduce their persons to perpetual slavery. So I think it can definitely be viewed as a form of displacement, right? So there is both, I will take you and I will take your land. These are not wholly different propositions, and they both can be done repeatedly, right? Repeated removal and repeated breaking apart of families through the system of chattel slavery. We also have a reliance by European white settlers on the agricultural knowledge of both indigenous people and enslaved Africans who were brought to this land to build the wealth of those settlers. So that's kind of another, there's differences and there's similarities in how those systems operated and how the knowledge may have been used. So in this context, I want to bring up an African-American aphorism that some of you may have heard before, called making a way out of no way. Because I'm going to jump ahead, 250 years or so after the beginning of the slave trade to what happened with Black land ownership after emancipation. So land having been a place for the extraction of enslaved labor, with emancipation, there became an opportunity for land to be a means of self-determination. So at the end of the Civil War, General Sherman met with Black leaders in Savannah, Georgia, to try to make a plan for what the newly freed, formerly enslaved would need. And their answer was land. And that's what, we commonly talk about as 40 acres and a mule. And it was an actual field order, growing out of this proposal by Black leaders, that the formerly enslaved would have sea islands all the way to 30 miles inland from Charleston, all the way down to the St. Johns River in Florida. This order was put out in January of 1865, but revoked months later by President Andrew Johnson. So even despite that revocation and despite some other strong headwinds, Black land ownership did increase following emancipation to a peak of about, the estimate is 16 to 19 million acres, which peaked sometime between 1910 and 1920. And I think it's just worth really noting what folks were up against in order to build that kind of land access. So this is happening in the face of the revocation of the 40 acres and a mule promise. This is happening in the face of what are known as the Black Codes, which had previously been the slave codes, which were state laws that limited all sorts of things, limited movement from place to place by Black people, prohibited owning property, prohibited meeting in groups, and importantly, allowed white men to buy out jail terms of Black people convicted of different petty crimes and forcing them to work for them for a year in order to pay off the bond. This increase in land ownership was happening at the same time as the rise of laws instituting segregation. So again, by 1920, there was over 900,000 Black farmers who had been formerly enslaved, owning 16 to 19 million acres of land. And that represented about 1 in 7 farmers in what is now the United States. So if ever there was, a story of entrepreneurship and the successes of capitalism, you would say, this is it. We would applaud. Everyone would applaud. And we can see that this is an example of, I think, capitalism for me, but not for thee, right? So after this peak of land ownership, throughout basically all the middle decades of the 1900s, there's various forces coming together and factors to reduce the ownership, so that by 1997, there was fewer than 2 million acres owned by Black landowners. So some of the causes were both official and unofficial, legal and outside the legal system. I don't think we can underestimate the effects of terrorist tactics like lynchings and forced dispossession in the Jim Crow era. So I don't know if folks might be familiar with Isabel Wilkerson's book, The Warmth of Other Suns, that talks about the Great Migration, which is the large numbers of Black people from the Southeast moving to the North and West. And she tells these really compelling stories of 3 particular individuals. But she also talks about how we know that people don't engage in mass migration unless there is extreme pressure on them, right? Unless there is a natural disaster or violence rising to a level that makes you leave your home. Some of the other mechanisms that that are thought to contribute to this decline in Black land ownership are just discriminatory inflated tax assessments and rates of tax foreclosure that were much higher in Black communities and neighborhoods. There are known to have been, explicit discriminatory regulations. So for a long time, there was actively exclusionary zoning where you could say this neighborhood can only have white people living in it. And then eventually, if that got struck down by the Supreme Court, the same effect would essentially be achieved by using income or pre-existing neighborhood maps to essentially try to achieve the same effect. Another big driver, because of the large number of Black farmers in particular, a lot of them are involved with trying to get loans and programs through the USDA. The USDA administers a lot of its programs through local commissions and boards that are essentially committees of those who are already established. So they are white male boards that decide who gets a farm loan and, very importantly, when they get their farm loan, right? Because if you're a farmer and you get your loan after the planting season, it's not going to help you. And a major contributor, most folks think, to this loss of land is also what's known as heir property, where land is passed down over time without a will and ends up being owned by large numbers of family members together jointly. And that's been, particularly common in Black families, although it exists in other contexts as well, because of a lack of access to attorney services and estate planning, as well as a justified, mistrust of lawyers and the legal system. I think it's important to recognize, and this is something that comes up a lot with folks that we work with, is while it is a problem on some levels, it is not simply a problem to be fixed. It is often the case that because of land being primarily acquired, post-emancipation, but pre-1930, we're talking about folks' grandparents and great-grandparents and great-great-grandparents. So it represents the work and sacrifice of generations to obtain ownership of land. And heir property can provide a way for the family member to come together and live on the land according to their needs. So some families that we work with, if there's a home or a couple of homes on property, they'll let, the family member who has the most need live in it. And many families do come up with creative ways to reach agreement about how they're going to manage land. At the same time, it is, I think, human nature also to sometimes find it difficult for dozens and dozens of people to agree on what to do with land.
Mary?
Yes.
We want to bring you and Jessica into conversation soon, and I know that heirs property is a really important thing to cover. So I'm wondering if we can bring you into conversation soon and maybe ask a couple questions about that. I don't know how much of your presentation you have left.
Sure. I can do like 2 more minutes or something. Does that sound good?
Yeah, great.
Okay. So just to talk briefly about one of the main drivers of land loss via heir property is that each state will have its own laws about how exactly it works, but every state has a partition statute allowing basically anyone who is a co-owner of land to petition the court to, in most cases, sell the land. So what happens is an outsider, perhaps a developer or investor, someone without the connection to the family land, will buy one distant cousin's interest in the land and then has the right to seek a partition sale of the land, at which that very investor or developer might go ahead and buy the entire land. There's been some efforts at reform. I would be remiss not to mention the main legal effort, main lawsuit to redress discrimination by the USDA was Pigford versus Glickman, which resulted in a huge settlement of over $2 billion. At the same time, one estimate of loss of wealth between 1920 and 2012 was 120 billion in terms of the worth of the land that was lost. So,
Thank you so much, Mary. I'm gonna bring Jessica back as well as myself. Where am I? There we go. There we are. Well, thank you both so much. Sorry, Mary, we had to, we're racing against time right now, but it's so important. Your work is so important, and this conversation is so important. I think one thing that's really clear from both of your presentations is that we can all see how the doctrine of discovery is alive today in the legal system, on the land, in all the little boxes that have been carved up in the land, and in our stories, in all of our stories. And I guess we don't have too much time, but I want to ask you, what do you wish that people understood about our legal system as it pertains to colonization and private property? Like what's the thing that you just wish that if you could really help everyone understand, they would just get it?
I think for me, Sarah, the part that I want folks to know is that it wasn't inevitable and it's not immutable. People made these things. These are policy choices that people have made over time, and that means we can make different choices. It's going to be hard, but it's doable.
And you, Mary?
yeah, I think, I spend most of my time talking to landowners about the legal system as it is, or maybe trying to push the boundaries where we can. But I can't tell you how often that involves disclaimers about how I'm not saying this is right and fair, but, right? So I just need to tell you how this says it's going to go down. And I know I'm not telling you what makes any sense. I know that this is not the way anyone would say this should go, but here's all the boxes they've checked on the other side to be able to do what they're doing.
Yeah, just like a very inhumane and kind of nonsensical. Like if the premise is that we all, deserve to be here in some way on this planet and live lives in our community that in the ways that are, a part of our culture, a part of our, the ways that we grew up with, it wouldn't make sense. None of this would make sense if that were the case. If equality or sovereignty or freedom were truly respected for all people, none of this would make sense. I think we closed the chat for the speakers. If we want to open the chat, curious if there's a phrase or a sentence that is sticking with people. And if you want to share that, the chat is open. And, as we're allowing things to move in, I guess I'll ask just one other short question very briefly. What are some of the impacts that you see in the loss of relationship in the communities that you work with? What are some of the impacts on us as human beings and the communities you work with when we commodify and enclose land?
In the case of Indigenous communities, I think obviously there's a wealth effect, right? A theft does that. But taking land in the manner that the United States did also meant taking a way of life. So for example, if you are a seasonal gatherer and you can no longer reach that berry patch, you can't do that anymore. If you hunt an animal that requires a certain habitat and that habitat's gone, you don't get to do that anymore. And that affects nutrition and spirituality and all sorts of ways that, you know, continue down the line. But the commodification of land also hurts white folks, right? I owe a debt that I will never be able to repay because it's a generational debt. And also, working to repay that debt helps liberate me.
And you, Mary?
Yeah, I've worked on more than one partition case, for example, with a Black landowner who was literally born on the land that is going to be sold through through a partition action. So, you know, it's their grandparents or parents or great grandparents' home, which may or may not still be standing. So there's just a lot involved in terms of level of knowledge and intimacy with the land, with the neighbors and community members, that once someone who is more removed from the land acquires ownership, you know, that's gone. What you know about, you know, the trees on your land, what you know about your neighbors and working together as a community, and just the family history when land's been passed down over time.
Yeah.
It's something, you know, that you can't put a dollar value on, but the value is not really replaceable.
Thank you. We've got some things coming into the chat that are sticking with people. Deep bone exhaustion, chattel. It's doable. I think the change is doable. There's a question about policy changes or choices that could be a first step. I don't know if we'll get to that, but maybe there's a follow-up email where we can include some of those things. Colonization does not spark joy. Yeah, a catch-22 or closed system. Conquest giving title like rape. Courts of the conquerors. That's a lot of people are kind of really with that. Yeah, working to repay the debt liberates me. And people just being with how unbelievably outrageous and sickening this all is. Thank you. There's a lot more in the chat. Thank you, Jessica and Mary, for these presentations. I'd like to weave in our friend Bronte Velez into this conversation. Bronte, your family comes from Boriquen, also known as the island of Puerto Rico, and you have been working to transform Sikh culture, a Sikh culture of violence for a long time, through the Black ritual arts. And you're also stewarding land in Kashaya Pomo territory. You've been connecting with land in that way. You as a practicing shepherd and cotton farmer, and as well as bringing good fire to the land with your partner Jordy. There's so much more I could say. You know, you're at Duke University, or Duke Divinity School, studying the prophetic tradition. If I were to share all the things that you're working on, we'd be here a lot of the day. But I wanna ask you. You know, you have been deep in this work of like the spiritual and material entanglements of land justice and all that we inherit that disconnect us from land. And I'm wondering if you can share a little bit of just your responses to this presentation and what it brings up for you, and you know, what the impact of disconnection for land has been for you, as well as what reunification with land has meant for you.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for those questions, and Mary and Jessica for the work that you do. I was just really feeling the notes in the chat around deep bone exhaustion, and the way that the legalese and contracts and as Tioka Singosfor says, the powers who think they are can deeply affect our material lives and our spiritual lives, and cause so much generational harm and interspecies harm. So I'm just with that pain, and I'm with that grief. And Jessica spoke to that debt that cannot be repaid. And I think of the Apostle Paul in the Christian tradition talking about the ministry of reconciliation. And I'm really trying to promote the ministry of irreconcilability, that there is some care that we need to do with irreconcilability. And some of my work with reparative action and experimenting with reparative action has also been that some of what you can't pay back asks us to do some really rigorous grief work and some really rigorous relational work. And that's some of that interest that we can't repay. It's to be truly impacted and to really let ourselves feel that level of loss. And I'm thinking of something from an episode of the show Atlanta, where there's an episode on season 3 about reparations. I'm from Atlanta, so I gotta rep the show. And there is an article about this episode on reparations, and a critic who wrote for Vulture, Jordan Taliha McDonald, she is reviewing the episode and she wrote, quote, "When one incurs an unpayable debt, having run up a tab that defies the logic of calculation, haunting is bound to set in. The soul is repossessed." And then I'm thinking also of Gil Scott-Heron talking about who will pay reparations on my soul, and that it is that level of loss. There is a soul loss. There is some Horcrux, Harry Potter type stuff going on. And I think that some of my practice as a descendant of enslaved Black folks in Turtle Island, in occupied Turtle Island, on my mother's side, and on my father's side as mestizo community in Boriquenda, also known as Puerto Rico colonially, some of that work is knowing that studying the fugitive tradition, the Black fugitive traditions and Indigenous fugitive traditions of ceremony to recover my soul and to recover the soul of the land and to honor our mutual, that mutual soul that cannot be taken. God knows white people can't take your soul. No. So some of that work for me has been working to repair with what some me and my friends call plant cesters, who are also traumatized by the legacies of enslavement, and to be in that companionship with beings who did not cause harm and also had incredible intelligence to support interruption and disruption of the legacies of enslavement. I'm thinking of what it is for me to work with cotton that is colored and to honor the monoculture to disrupt this the monoculturated project of cotton, and that it wasn't, of course they make the most beautiful things, they try to make them all white when there's all these other varieties. So it's so beautiful for me to grow my pink cotton, and also to feel cotton's intelligence and co-liberation as an abortifacient for pregnant, enslaved Black folks who could also eat on the cotton bark and disrupt this violence as being used in chattel slavery and being used as livestock. And that's some of my work also with collaborating with animals and with sheep, is that my companionship with the sheep that I get to take care of liberates me. It liberates my ancestors. It liberates the spirit of also being used as chattel. And it allows me to atone something only I can atone. No one can do that for me, to me. There are things that people could pay for to help me do that, but that is only work that I can do with me and my ancestors and with the land. And then there's other work that other people need to do with their ancestors and the land for atonement. So I'll pause there and pass it back to you, Sarah.
Mm. Well, I'm with the embeddedness of relationships that you are working with in the plant world, in the animal world, our fellow creatures. And I'm thinking about like the impact of the separation and the enclosure of humanity into its own box, into its very separate sphere. I mean, we've enclosed the land, but we've also enclosed ourselves. And I'm curious if you want to speak to what is it like, what are the invitations that you would make to people to grow their kinship relationships and rejoin the community of beings in the community of creation that we're a part of.
Thank you.
And I think we have like about a couple of minutes, and then I'll pass it to you to actually do a little, I know you wanted, we're gonna do a little embodiment exercise.
Okay.
So I'll pass it to you here.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm thinking about, I don't know if it's just Donna Haraway and Anna Singh who talk about the plantational scene. I think there's some other scholars who also describe the geologic epoch we're in as the plantational scene, which is shifting from this language of the Anthropocene or Anthropocene that makes it seem as though the era we're in is all humans at large, created this kind of violence and impact on the planet. And instead it positions this moment we're in climate collapse as the honoring, or not honoring, but acknowledging and holding accountable the geologic forces of white supremacy and colonization and land theft and displacement of Black and Indigenous peoples, and how that literally changed the weather that we're in. And that extraction changed the weather, and that lack of relationship changed the weather. And so some of my intimacy with recovering my relationship with the weather is about attention and honing in on this presence and lineage of prophetic traditions where paying attention to the weather was essential for making decisions. And paying attention to the weather and the cosmos, augury or auspicious practices were used by the Roman state to make war decisions, legal decisions, etc. So this is also, this kind of divination work is a part of some of even our highest seats of power. The word inauguration still comes from this work of augury and divination. And so some of my reclamation of that is about, this is kind of corny because I was thinking about what for me is the opposite of the doctrine of discovery. And I really don't like what I'm about to say, but something about it is around having a covenant with curiosity. I think it only sounds corny because it's like also an alliteration, but the covenant of curiosity for me is what really feels like that atonement with the weather. And it is about that the logics of the doctrine of discovery assumed people knew anything about anything and that they could just take whatever they wanted to take, that white people could take whatever they wanted to take. And the logics of a covenant of curiosity means that there's intimacy, there's consent, there's questions, there's relationship that has to be built. And most importantly, there's presence. There's a quality of presence. That's really important. I think that ministry of presence is a very liberatory act, when so much of the violences that have taken place to arrive us at this weather and this harm and this loss of relationship with place and one another, was completely not present and completely not feeling the spirit of another being, not listening to the spirit of a land. And I'm sure at many different junctures, the land and people told people this is not okay, but people refuse to listen. So I think that listening and that deep awareness allows us to receive what the land and our relations are asking of us for restoring right relationship.
Mm. Well, in the spirit of that, I'm also just loving that there's a shepherding photo behind me. I'm at a convent right now, so I think that's for you.
Oh.
I'm in the spirit of that of that ministry of presence, of that covenant with curiosity. I'd love to ask if you would lead us in a very mini version of something that people could spend a lot more time doing, but maybe like for a minute or two, engage in one of the activities that you've been trying on. Would that be all right?
Yes, absolutely. So I just want to start with this brief quote from a poem from Michael Lee. It's called The Taking of Lead. And in the poem, there's these soldiers who keep killing one another day after day. And this father keeps taking out the bullets and making them into gold and then pouring that back into the wounds. And then the soldiers keep reanimating. And the son is like, why do you keep doing this? And they just keep doing this every day. And in the poem, they say, writes, these instruments of war are doors to an end. After a war, the side with the most land and least dead always dances and makes love inside the sound of drums. It seems to me this is all the body has ever wanted. I wish to see if there will ever come a time where upon reawakening, they will each forget their language and not know the name for those terrible burning snouts they carry, and thus not know what they are used for. These are dangerous men, not because they carry a weapon, but because what they carry is named, and so it has only one imaginable purpose. Imagine a whole field of soldiers forgetting their language and being possessed only with their bodies want most in the end to dance and to love. And I just think about what that invitation is to in this practice of unlearning, in this spiritual discipline of unlearning. I want us to just be with an object for a moment near us. That we might even see as a ritual object. I have in front of me this candle holder at this Airbnb. So just get anything, whether it be from just anything near you, just grab what catches your eye. What I just read was from a poem called The Taking of Lead by Michael Lee. And the invitation is to, you have an idea of what this object is, but it's as though you just don't know what this object is in this moment. If you didn't have a name for this object, you didn't know its function, and maybe you didn't even know that you could thingify, as was talked about earlier, this object. Maybe they're not even a thing. But just to notice their contours and their shape. And we'll just take 2 minutes to imagine who they might be through what they're invoking in you versus what they might do for you or what you might take from them. We're just going to take a moment to just bear witness to this being in front of us. And maybe someone could time us to bring us back.
Thank you, Bronte. And thank you everyone for joining in this moment. Thank you, Bronte, for leading it. We are going to move towards breakout groups, because I'm sure there's probably a lot moving. We are setting those up again. If you do not want to join a discussion, simply don't accept the prompt for you to join a group, and you'll stay in the main group. And hopefully, if you wanted to be part of a Black, Indigenous, or other people of color caucus space, you added B to your name and will be in a group there. Everyone else, we will place you in a group of 4 or 5 people for 12 minutes. Brittany, what's our
Yeah.
timing?
Yeah, we'll take 12 minutes, and just to share, Sarah shared at the top of this, but a lot did join late. So for those who joined late, we are doing a little adventure makeover to our breakout groups. The technological reality of everyone being down for mother law and complicit no more means the curated breakout groups is not a possibility for us. So we're doing randomized breakout groups. We encourage you to find your groups and your friends offline and in between sessions. And we are doing specific breakout groups. If you are a Black, Indigenous, or person of color, and you want to be in a group with just BIPOC people, we are making those rooms. You can rename yourself with a B in front of your name, or private chat me or Amy. Amy, send a flare in the chat so people know where to find you. Other than that, enjoy making new friends on the decolonial adventure.
And your
And here are
questions
the questions.
are, what's my relationship to land like? What did our legal system teach me about land? And is there something I'm grieving there? And what do I want my relationship with land to be? So again, make sure to split up the time. These are going to be brief answers, about 3 minutes each. If you could select a timekeeper that to ensure that folks have a chance to answer. And we'll see you back here in 12 minutes. Thank you. I'm gonna pause the recording.
It was great.
All right, thank you all. You should all be, I think,
No,
back
it's
by
just-
now.
I don't know what happened.
Sorry, Sarah, I muted you.
That's all right. I see what you did there. Welcome back, everyone. I hope your conversations were a rich beginning, because they can only be a beginning with that much time, to stirring up and chewing on some of what has transpired amongst us today. I'd like to bring in our theological council, who has been meeting these minutes. So Sister Gail, Bronte, Janine, and who else do we have here today? And Sarah Jolina. I'm, gonna have to skip who each of you are. Your bios are on our website if people want to know more about your theological background. But I'm curious if you want to share some of what came up in your conversation just now, and any of the pearls that came up. We've heard Mama Bear say of her authority as a clan mother in speaking for her people and for the earth. I do not need feminism. I am the law. And I posed a question to you of what theological ideas or traditions can help us transcend the authority of colonial law, of man's law, of these boxes that we've heard about today and that have determined so much, too much of our lives and of the lives of so many beings, and move towards a deeper authority of Mother Earth. And what are the costs of not doing this? So I'm curious if each of you or one of you or two of you want to give a little bit of a synopsis of some of the things that came up for you in this conversation.
In the interest of time, I'm not sure if I'm only seeing 2 of us now. We've got some more folks back. It seemed like our conversation naturally answered that question in 2 ways. One had to do with recognizing the way that Christian scripture had been used within every stage of the doctrine of discovery, from the earliest to today. And we came up with some threads of how we might use Christian scripture differently, but recognizing that that's a certain challenge to the authority as it's been, as the text has been handed down and interpreted. And then we had ideas about going outside of that authority of the scripture. So I hope that that maybe opens up to folks sharing a little bit more of the specifics.
Yeah, and one of the things we talked about was something that my own mentor Thomas Berry had said, that we need to put the Bible on the shelf for 20 years and read the scriptures of the universe. And then Bronte had an experience of her grandmother putting the Bible on the ground and letting the ants eat the Bible and relating that Bible to really rooting Bible, the word in earth itself. And the second thing is a faulty cosmology is going to yield a faulty theology. So if the cosmology or our understanding of universe is faulty, it's going to yield something that's faulty theologically. And then finally, I'd like to say that what was coming up in me is the fact that our cultural coding does not have the integrity or the wisdom to guide us forward. So what is needed? What goes beyond our cultural coding? And the best thing I could see, or what rises in me, is our universe coding, or we could call it our genetic coding, that we all share because we come out of the fireball. We come out of a 13.7 billion year story. And when we look at some concepts of universe law that goes beyond our current system, because universe law will just is a way of being imaginative and real about who are we? And so the first principle of universe law is that rights originate where existence originates, and that which confers existence confers rights. And the universe is that which confers existence. So the rights come out of the principles of universe, and those principles include the right for every being to fulfill its role in the great community of existence, and the right for each differentiated interiority to be in relationality in the total communion. I mean, it's like we figure out how the universe works over 13.7 billion years. It's all about relationship, and it's all about supporting diversity in communion and honoring the deep subjectivity of not only the human, but our multi-species community. And law needs to address the totality of the disappearance of that subjectivity. And that's the abomination of the doctrine of discovery.
So much of what was being talked about by Jessica and the other phenomenal women we've been able to listen to today has been around what is order, and this notion of the doctrine of discovery seeing itself as part of the will of God. But in doing so, let us not forget that the first commandment in the Christian tradition is that you shall have no God before me. The two-row wampum that Michelle Shenandoah and Mama Bear showed us is an expression of the truth of two peoples coming with their full light together and creating a treaty and an agreement to live in peace and harmony. That is a full expression of what two cultures coming together on the same river in two different boats can look like. It is for us to revitalize the two-row wampum treaty as being far more attuned to what Christianity and Judaism and the Abrahamic traditions are preaching, are suggesting and experiencing. And as part of that, to remember Leviticus 25:23, the land shall not be sold in perpetuity, for the land is mine. And Psalm 24:1, the earth is the Lord's and everything therein. The land that never can and never will and never shall and never has belonged to humans as ownership. It is first and foremost self-sovereign as part of the divine creation, as are we.
Thank you so much. I'm curious. I think I saw that Bronte dropped off, but maybe they just.
Yeah, I'm keeping an eye out for them,
Okay.
but they are not here right now.
Got it.
Oh, now they are. Hey, Bronte. I can't add you to the spotlight because your video is off and I can't pin it. It won't let me pin, but if you want
Come off mute.
to come off mute. If you have anything to add, otherwise. I'm guessing there might be some tech stuff going on.
Right.
Thanks,
Well,
Bronte.
thank you, Bronte. I'm glad we heard from you earlier. I'd pin that maybe in the future we'll hear from you around interspecies prophetic traditions and things like that I know you're into. Oh wait, there you are. Okay. And just for folks, we're probably going to go about 7 to 10 minutes over. You can leave when you need to. There will be a recording. You will receive it. But this is just so important. I am refusing to cut it short. Bronte, anything you'd like to add? People have just been sharing some of the pearls from your conversation as a theological counsel.
I don't know. My connection will be strong enough from my computer. So I'm gonna try. I see confused faces, so I'm gonna just mute and try calling my phone.
Might work if you turn your video off, Bronte. If you want to share that way, that I think we'll be able to. It feels like the connection will be strong enough without video.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh my gosh, so sorry. I think what just happened is talking about disconnection, the spirit of disconnection through technology. Amen. That's what I
Amen.
think that's opening us to. We need to get in the flesh and on the land together, okay? But I think one of the things that I just wanted to share that didn't come up in our group, but was coming up for me throughout our time together was thinking about Dr. King's sermon, But If Not, that he gives in 1967, a couple of months before he is assassinated in Memphis. And it's called But If Not. He delivers it at Ebenezer Baptist Church. And he's talking about this difference between an if faith versus a though faith. And he's referencing this scripture in Daniel 3, where Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are asked to kind of put on this disobedient faith, this though faith, this faith that whether or not God delivers them from this moment of being placed in a furnace, that they'll still continue to worship the covenant that they have with God. And I think that there's something about this this sovereignty of their though faith that Dr. King describes it as, that I'm just interested, this though faith that extends beyond, that is disobedient to laws that are not in alignment with the earth, with indigenous communities, with one another, being disobedient to the abuse of the ways that unjust Christian interpretation of scripture has justified this violence, and to have with that though faith, that higher covenant and higher agreement, and to let that disobedience be holy, because some of the things we might want to do for rematriation, it may not be legal. some stuff is not, we're not going to find it on paper. We're not going to find things that are legal. And some things do need higher agreement, higher covenants, other covenants. So I just wanted to pass that back to the center, and so grateful for our time today.
Thank you for so much. This is already so rich, and just in a short amount of time, I feel like we've connected with a lot of bits that people could take deeper, take into themselves deeper, explore on their own. I would love to quickly move towards previewing next week. So if we could get the slides up, and I will get some of this. There we go. So next week, we are going to be moving into the story of how this all connects with women, the subjugation of women, with the witch
Sarah,
hunts.
Sarah,
Yes.
do you
Yes.
want to share the homework first?
Yes. Well, yeah. Okay, I'll do the homework first. Yes. Our homework for this week is one of two options. One invitation is to extend the exercise that Bronte led us in, that covenant with curiosity, and to go out onto the land, and be in that state of curiosity for 20 or 30 minutes. So just to really extend that stretch of mind and spirit, with more time and outside. The second invitation is to watch a 5-minute cartoon from our friend Janelle Orsi about the pathologies of home ownership. And there's some reflection questions that we'll share with you in your email, and that will be on the course page for thinking about after watching that 5-minute cartoon, followed by an invitation to then continue that exploration with some family land research and journaling. Whether your family has a history of owning property or has been dispossessed or displaced of land, we have some invitations for you in reflecting on that. So those are the two options for homework this week. And of course, you can find everything on our course page. And next week, we will be digging into how all of this connects with the subjugation of women through the witch hunts that were happening at the time of enclosures of land, as well as the beginnings of colonization, and how that really initiated a co-arising of capitalism and colonialism, and really where patriarchy fits into this, and exactly how the church was responsible in large part for that project. So that is what is coming up next. And before we end, we just will close with some words from a poet, Kemi Alabi. Again, if you have any questions, you know where to reach us at hello@landjusticefutures.org. And most things you'll be able to find on our course page. So with that, we are going to move towards closing. And I'd love to read this poem. We have talked a lot about, living in this ecosystem of take. And it's actually an ecosystem that needs to be give and take, a cycle of growth and decay, birth and death, beings eating and being eaten. So really bringing life energy in or bringing in and giving it back or giving it away. And with the inheritance of the economy and the culture and the way of life that we have with us today, we inherit some questions as well that come with that. And I think that is what this poem by Kemi Alabi really speaks to. And this is 44 questions to ask while binging.
Amy and Sarah and I will be reading this.
Yes.
And it'll take 2 or 3 minutes. So before we begin, let's just transition into transition. Let's take a deep breath. Return all that we've received to the to the earth, to our feet on the floor. Turn off our thinking brains and let these questions land more deeply. Sarah, do you want to begin?
Yes, I will. Thank you. 44 questions to ask while binging by Kemi Alabi. How many hands have touched this food? What were their intentions? How vast is this range? What makes them hands at all?
How many seeds survived their birth for this? Did you count yourself? 7. From sprout to pluck, how many breaths old was the oldest? 8. What's become of its homeland?
9. How many breaths will it add to yours? 10. Or is this a thing that takes? 11. Which things were born dead for this? 12. Did you count yourself?
"13. Which born free? 14. Which born food? 15. Is there a state in between? 16. How old was the well of that answer?
17. If governments and their signed scrolls are Plato's cave wall shadows, where is the real sun? 18. What's become of its homeland? 19. How many generations removed from the land are you? 20. What floor takes its place? 21. What is it built on top of?
22. Are the people who tended that place still alive? 23. Are there any living descendants? 24. Is their language still spoken on earth? 25. If you heard it, would your feet twitch? 26. Or does dead mean gone?
27. How many gone things in your place? 28. Did you count yourself? 29. What does your body and the day it makes cost? 30. What is its price in gone things?
31. Is this sustainable? Better, regenerative? 32. Or will this make you the most gone thing alive? 33. Is God or the human the cave wall shadow? 34. Who says the shadow is nothing at all?
35. Are you still eating? 36. Who? 37. What for? 38. What have you grown in its place?
39. How much is enough? 40. Is enough a place or a count? 41. Is there a state in between? 42. Or does enough mean gone?
43. Did you enough yourself? 44. In the language of the oldest gone thing, how do you say devour?
Thank you all. This concludes our third session for the Motherhouse Starter Series. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you to all who spoke, our theological council, our speakers. Thank you to T. Martin for the opening song. Thank you to Kemi Alabi for that poem. And thank you for being part of this movement. We'll see you next week.